Thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I know there's a lot of fun workshops going on right now with Riot and parallelism and concurrency, so I appreciate you all coming to this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about building incremental and reproducible data pipelines for tackling climate change. This is kind of joint work out of the University of Cambridge between departments of computer science, departments of ecology, zoology, some land economy, and the conservation initiative. It's also joint work with Michael Dales, who you might remember from a very flashy talk about 10 minutes ago. So some of the slides and some of the information is thanks to him. So brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. Mostly I'm going to talk about problems in kind of modern ecological research, especially very computational or data intense research. And then how we've gone about trying to build pipelines to get a handle on some of this. And then towards the end, we'll have a few demos of future tools that we envisage that perhaps some of our ecologist friends could use to help kind of make their research more reproducible and also hopefully scale in the future. But firstly, what's going wrong in modern ecological research? Well, like many fields, kind of experimental sciences, there's been a shift towards using computers and using kind of data science practices and scientific programming to produce outputs and research. And that means combining programming languages, particularly things like Python and R, alongside machine learning and within ecology, remote sensing, so that's satellite imagery, image files, maps, projections, all of these things are now being crunched into the computer, and then hopefully a result is coming out the other side. More often than not, especially in our kind of research group, we tend to see that people are running out of memory actually, or not getting the results that they thought they were, and actually the pipelines that they're producing are not very reproducible. And when we ask them, for example, to regenerate some results, they're unable to. And so we're coming at this as this is a systems problem. This is actually a computer science problem perhaps, as well as maybe an educational problem, and more resources need to be put into, say, teaching undergrads more about computer science in these fields. But for now, we're looking more at actually how can we do things at the operating system level or using other programs to build harnesses around all of this to produce more reproducible and incremental data pipelines. But some context about actually what the ecological research is that we're working on is looking at avoided deforestation projects. So these are projects in the tropical moist forest regions where people come along and decide to protect a bit of forest land and say these trees won't be cut down. And what we want to know is essentially how useful is this in tackling deforestation. And the way that the ecologists do this is a counterfactual analysis. So they say, actually, what would happen if this project didn't exist here? Kind of suggesting that maybe the trees would be cut down and therefore they're doing a good job. And so to be able to do this, they have to do a lot of data processing to find good counterfactual analysis pixels to match back onto the project and say, these 2 points in space are very similar, given some set of variables. And then we look over time how these are changing. And hopefully what they see is that actually the project itself is keeping trees and the other areas are not keeping trees. And then they can make some claim about how useful they are as a project. So on the screen, we got some visualizations of this. And on the left is kind of the analysis that they want to do where one is kind of decreasing more of the carbon stock and the other one is staying higher. And that's the project. And so the difference in between the two is actually the impact that the project's had. But they use a lot of data inputs to this. For example, maps that show accessibility. So one of the variables is trying to work out how remote a certain pixel is. Something very deep in a forest should be matched to something else that's quite deep in a forest or similar. It shouldn't be matched to something beside a busy road, for example. But there's a lot of uncertainty in this data. And so we found when trying to reproduce some of this analysis that one of the main primary data sets that they were using, which is this European Commission's tropical moist forest data set, which is kind of categorical data for the tropical forests that says the forest is either undisturbed, degraded, deforested, regrowth, water, or other. And within the year that we were working on this, they updated their data set, just changed the URL that was pointing to this data set, and we downloaded 2 different copies. And when we tried to compare results, we were getting different results. And of course, it took us a long while, maybe 2 weeks, to work out that actually one of the inputs was completely different without us knowing. And the 2 images are actually showing some of that difference in Indonesia. And you can see on the right, we've got a lot more deforestation, that's the orange pixels, than the one on the left. This is actually for the same year, so this is for 2008, but the data sets have just been downloaded a year apart from the same URL, and then put onto a machine where everyone is just using this data as kind of a source of truth. But depending on which directory you choose, then you would get different results. And actually, these results are staggeringly different. Just for Indonesia alone, we can see that actually there's a 3% increase in the amount of deforested pixels. And that comes from, well, we'll see in a minute, like a variety of really good sound reasons for updating their data set, but there was no way for us to actually version this or be able to get the old data set back. And so the results that were done maybe in 2021 can no longer be reproduced without sending an email and hopefully being able to get that old data set back. Here are some of the reasons that they give on their kind of change log for their data set. Again, all very valid reasons, but without the ability to version that data ourselves, we end up in this position where we can't reproduce the data. And certainly it makes it very hard for anyone to kind of informally reason about that and be able to tell, for example, computer scientists who are coming along to try and help speed up their analysis, which data set they were using. And then furthermore, if you go on to publish this data in some kind of journal or inform some kind of policy on climate change, then how are you supposed to be able to reproduce those results, say, 20 years down the line to double check that the analysis was done properly? Yes, so this is one of the problems. But there's also uncertainty in code and our dependencies, which maybe this whole room is much more familiar with. Here I've got a very small example. GDAL is kind of the de facto library for doing geospatial data manipulations within Ecology. And here we've got 2 different minor version bumps of a CLI tool, and we are calculating this terrain roughness index. The actual thing we're calculating isn't too important, but between these 2 small minor bumps, the default algorithm was actually changed for how they calculated this. Again, for a very good reason. It was that the default algorithm was actually one for underwater terrain, and most people were using this for land-based calculations. And so actually, when you do this result, this image should be totally black, but it's not. It's not coming out too well in the projector, but actually there's a wide range of new values in the pixels. And so just between 2 minor versions with the same CLI being used, we're getting 2 different outputs as well. We do have versioning here, but it's very easy for someone to change the version of GDAL on a shared machine that everyone's using because it has a lot of cores to be able to do kind of the data crunching that they want to do, and suddenly they're getting new results. And again, when you go on to publish this, the practices within this field aren't things like producing some kind of lock file for all the things that you were using or anything like that. And the question does become, should it be like that? And I'll kind of reason about maybe why it shouldn't be just that ecologists should be producing lock files for everything. Another one is just actually hardware actually produces its own uncertainties. Here's an example that Michael found, and there's an issue open, but it turns out that it's not really NumPy's problem. And that's just by putting a number into an array and then pulling it out again, we actually get slightly different floating point numbers coming out. And again, so these numbers are incredibly small, but when summed across a large region, these small numbers start adding up, and we start getting differences in results, and that's causing headaches, and it takes a long time to debug, or more probably, it's never noticed, and these results are just published, and we move on, and that's also an issue, I think. I really like this quote from a researcher in Edinburgh, which is that no one with the same casual attitude to experimental instrumentation as many researchers have to code would be allowed anywhere near a lab. And I think this is trying to get at, there's a lot of people working in, say, wet labs that have a lot more kind of procedures and policies about trying to make things reproducible, or at least trying to work out what you did by keeping a lab notebook, all these sorts of best practices. But yet, in the coding world, it's kind of open your laptop, write a bunch of code, write a Jupyter notebook, and then get I don't know, a CSV out the other end, attach it to a paper, publish and move on. And there are a lot of people trying to do a lot of good work here as well. For example, Zenodo is kind of taking off as a kind of platform for publishing data, and we're getting a little bit more almost open source-like tendencies to some of this, but nowhere near enough, I think, for how important some of this analysis is when we think about climate policy. So we came at this as kind of computer scientists that were embedded into an ecological kind of research group, and we wanted to take existing code that they were writing at the time and kind of make it incremental and also somewhat reproducible using tools that we already had in OCaml. And some of you might be familiar, if you've ever released a package onto the OPAM repository, that there's a vast array of CI that gets run on that. And different versions of OCaml, different operating systems, different architectures. And so we're actually reusing the exact same underlying tools as goes into all of those CI tools. And one of them is a kind of custom builder that allows you to build things. And if anyone's used Docker build, it's actually principally very similar. It's just that we have more control and it's written in OCaml. And so the architecture of our builder is very simple in that we have basically two abstractions. One is the sandbox, and that's how we actually execute the code in some kind of safe way. And the other one is some kind of store where we put all the results afterwards. And then there's a link between those two where if you build off of previous results, you actually just want to create a new snapshot from that data, do your kind of incremental build and put that back in, and hopefully use some copy on write kind of thing to make this all data efficient and fast. And then you can see hopefully in that top right that the spec file is very similar again to a Docker file. So this is our underlying builder that we're using. Once we have a way of building code in some kind of incremental and reproducible way, we then need a way of combining builds to be able to take one of these data pipelines and describe it fully. And to do that, we use a library in OCaml called occurrent. Occurrent is some kind of semi-monadic, semi-arrow-like library that allows us to describe a dependency graph and then feed results into kind of new functions that expect some inputs that them themselves are incremental. So if one input changes, we know how to recalculate the dependency tree to be able to get fresh results depending on how something changed. This is a very short pipeline for doing a Docker build, where we take some git commit, we pull some OCaml Debian image, we then construct a Docker file that might say do June build at run test, then we build it and we tag it and we could push it somewhere. So actually all of these tools are pretty much all we need to be able to do any of these dataflow pipelines for Ecology. We just substitute, instead of OCaml, we start building things in Python and R, and instead of kind of pushing images to Docker Hub, we might start pulling out data results at the end that have some kind of tag about how information is flowed through this dependency graph. There's actually one difference, though, that's quite important, and that's we're not doing things just sequentially. We actually need to be able to essentially reduce data into a single point. So for example, here, we need to be able to have the accessibility tiles that I was talking about before, ecoregions, elevation maps, the country's raster image, slopes to be able to decide how steep a certain bit of terrain is, and actually then when we go to generate some pixels, we need to feed all of that back into a single node, which is a little different than just building sequentially as you go along, as you might do with an OCaml build, where you say, install my dependencies, the next step is to build, the next step is to run tests, and that's very linear. Here we actually need to do multiple things in parallel and then bring them all down into one. And so we've added support into OBuilder to be able to do this sort of thing and be able to link previous images, data directories into one single node and be able to then run the computation. And so you can start thinking of this maybe a little similar to a makefile or something like that, or your June stanzas, but now we're able to describe that in OCaml. And this is an example of the kind of data pipeline graph that we get out the other side, where green boxes are showing successful builds, gray boxes are things that are yet to run, and yellow boxes are things that are sitting in the queue to run in a moment. And we kind of control the amount of, kind of similar to specifying the jobs, we control the amount of kind of things that can execute in parallel. And all of that parallelism is not multi-core parallelism, it's just normal process execution to get us that parallelism. So I'll show a quick live pipeline for some of the things that we're doing. So the first thing to note, it's very complicated. These pipelines are not simple, and this is not the right UI to show anyone. But I think it does get to the point of kind of like, the pipelines that are being produced in ecological research are not just very straightforward. All the more reason that this is an important area of research, I think, because the complexity is kind of growing, and therefore the amount of uncertainty that's in there is probably growing too. But if we zoom into some of this, we can start seeing what we're actually doing. And again, we've got our rescaling of data, we've got generating country rasters, and we calculate some pixels, and we do other things. This is not actually how an ecologist wants to kind of build pipelines, because a lot of ecology is actually very visual. It's about maps, it's about generating things that are like countries, are forests, and things like that. And so we added a new kind of visualization on top of this to be able to actually look at what data is being generated at any individual build step. And so here, for example, we're generating a matching area, and this is an area that we're allowed to draw pixels from. So we can see like an area that's been cropped out, and I can tell you that's actually the forest, that's the project. And everywhere around it is actually where we're allowed to take our counterfactual analysis pixels from. So there's some areas that are being chopped out, and that's due to things like it's a different ecoregion, it's not even tropical moist forest. We've also got country borders, because jurisdictional policies kind of decide how similar areas will be at the end of the day. And so the actual science behind that isn't necessarily that important, but this is all being built with OCaml, and we're able to kind of tell users what our data dependencies are, and so the builds that have gone into doing this, and so you can go backwards and actually check the inputs that went into this output. We've also got hashes of the data that we're actually producing, but also we now have this visualization that allows, say, an ecologist to check, or people who are programming in OCaml to check if their data is correct. And that can be really hard. For example, getting a latitude and longitude the wrong way around obviously completely invalidates your results, but being able to see that in, say, a terminal is very hard, but being able to see that on a map is actually pretty easy. So that was kind of our first experiment into this. I'm not saying that that is the ideal solution, because it has a few problems. The dependency on the OCaml runtime and graph is only known during execution. So actually, OCurrent is, as I said, somewhat monadic, and that means there's a bind in there, and that means we don't actually know what the shape of the graph looks like until we run the thing. But also, it's a eDSL, so it's embedded in the OCaml language itself, and that means we have full access to the power of OCaml to generate more graph whenever we want. For example, we can have a conditional statement that generates a random number, and if it's above 10, then we choose this bit of pipeline, otherwise we choose this bit of pipeline. And so we don't actually know anything about that graph, and that means it's not very reproducible in a certain sense. It's maybe a little more reproducible once we've actually done the analysis and we have everything on disk, but it's not known just by looking at it or reading the OCaml code what's going to happen. We have to run it. So that's a problem. The second problem is actually it requires you to know OCaml. And whilst everyone in the room might be like, yeah, that's fine, and I would love to do that, no ecologist wants to learn OCaml, and I don't think anytime soon we would be able to convince them to learn OCaml. There's a great paper by Mary Shaw that kind of describes some of this as saying that there's a lot of people who are vernacular programmers. These are programmers that are having to program because it's part of their job in terms of trying to do research, but they themselves are maybe not interested in programming, have no professional education in programming, and so I think trying to provide tools that may be written in OCaml to these people, but are not necessarily themselves an OCaml interface is maybe the right way to go about this. And so we started thinking about, well, what ways are ecologists actually familiar with describing some of these things? And Markdown was kind of the thing that bubbled to the top. Ecologists were writing Markdown. They were writing Markdown to help document some things. the R programming language has kind of a baked-in R Markdown support, which is very similar to Jupyter Notebook, but you're writing Markdown in R instead. And so we kind of ran with this idea that what if actually our specification for this dependency graph, what if we could pull it straight out of the Markdown they were writing? And so with that, we would have to add some extra kind of things that they would have to add to be able to say, for example, if you need some environment variables, or what kind of base image would you like to build off of? And obviously, you need to describe the whole graph. You can't just say, this is kind of how you do it, and then you'll find your way. A second thing was converting maybe to scripts instead of Jupyter Notebooks at the time. This wasn't too hard because actually many of our ecologist friends were already doing this. It's maybe a more common workflow in things like R than in Python for data science. But there are ways to kind of turn notebooks into scripts as well. And so we kind of ran with this idea for the same analysis that we just showed. And we actually could generate these graphs from the description that they were giving us in Markdown. And actually, the Markdown is much richer than the OCaml one because they're describing also the documentation that goes along with running any of this code. So they might say, for example, actually to generate this Jedi data, which is a kind of LiDAR trying to work out how tall canopy heights are, these are the things that you need to run. But we can actually pull that into this graph, and you can probably maybe just about read that this box here is actually the scripts that need to be run with some inputs, and this has been labeled as the Jedi data. So now our dependency graph is actually a lot more kind of informative and easier to debug as well. Easier to know if you've actually constructed what you thought you constructed, whereas again, if we go back to this example, good luck working out if that's the right dependency graph or what you want to do. And so now we kind of coined this little tool to do this, Shark, and I can give a little demo of that as well. And that's actually just running right here. So this is just a Markdown that's being rendered very simply into HTML, but actually all of the boxes have been executed. And I executed them beforehand, so we don't have to wait here all day for it to run. But we've actually lifted all of the same things that we put into the OCurrent pipeline into this new pipeline. And so, for example, here, we do this fetching of data for some region in France, and we can go and look at that data just as we could before, because it's using the same libraries underneath. And we can double check that we did, in fact, download the right bit of data, and we did. And we also have some hashes for the things that we did, and the commands that we ran. We also have this ability to extract the data back out of this kind of reproducible engine that we're building so that people can share it. And the plan there is actually to also attach a lot of data about how that was generated, because it's all sitting there in the kind of engine and in the store, and all we have to do is think of a good way of passing that data on to someone to be able to reproduce it. And again, we're not aiming for total reproducibility. We're not looking for bit-by-bit correct programs at the moment. We're looking for how do we add as much extra information that at least allows someone in theory to go off and do their best at reproducing it. Because that would be a huge step up from where we are currently. So there's this second bit that says there's also a shell. And so this came about again from what is the common workflow in ecology at the moment. And actually a lot of it is shell programming. A lot of it is actually executing things in the terminal and hoping for the best that they worked. The terminal interacts with the operating system in some kind of immutable, ever going forward kind of way. And that's useful, and I think a lot of us are familiar with that, and we have tools for trying to manage that. For example, Git, for being able to say, yes, I am moving forward, but I also want you to basically track for this directory what I'm doing so that I can commit that, and in the future, hopefully undo that if I didn't want that change. But there's no general kind of solution for this for a shell. And that would be super cool for ecologists who might log on to their big machine, start doing some work, produce some results, and then suddenly go, I have no idea how I did that, I don't know where I started from, and all I've got is a kind of bash history that says some commands that I ran, but that's also mixed up with a lot of commands that was trial and error. Maybe you undid some things, you generated a file, you removed it, you didn't want it, and now the shell history is very complicated, and we don't know, as I said, we don't know where you started from, and there's no way really of tying a particular command to a particular output. and also a particular command to a particular input or set of inputs. And so we started thinking about how do we build a shell that allows ecologists to be able to do reproducible data science. And actually, the tools are all there in the thing that we've built so far, which is these kind of reproducible builds that go forward. And now all we need to do is add a fancy terminal UI on top of that, and then in the future make it very fast and add lots of bells and whistles. And I can give a quick demo of that as well. So here we are in a terminal on a dev machine, and I'll have to do this one-handed, so please forgive me if it takes a bit of time. We can start a session in our shell, and we have some information here already that actually we're running in an OCaml OPAM shell. Again, ecologists might use a different geospatial one. I'm just using that for here. We know that actually it's an alpine image. We're the user OPAM. We're in home OPAM, and we have this weird kind of FSR net off. And the idea here is actually when we interact with the shell, we want to interact with the shell in different modes to try and help protect us from making silly mistakes. So here, for example, the file system is read-only, and we can't do anything to actually write anything at the moment. That also means that we kind of know at this point, we're not going to do any changes to the file system, so there's no need for us to actually do any snapshotting either. The person is just having a look around and seeing what data is there. And this kind of constitutes maybe like 50% of the programming that you do in the shell anyway. And so we may as well just let the user be explicit about that and turn off all the checks on things. So we might want to check what OCaml version we're running here. We hope that it's 5.2. So we might do something like opam exec, OCaml c-version, I think. Hopefully that runs. And we get a fatal error, and we kind of wonder what went wrong. All we were doing was printing an OCaml version. It turns out actually that opam exec tries to write a temporary log file whenever we run it, no matter what commands we give it. And so this was something I wasn't aware of and only found out by writing this little tool. So that's like an interesting thing in and of itself, that now we have a little bit more insight into what all these commands are actually doing anytime we run them, and what kind of implicit dependencies they have. For example, if I say opam install June, actually it needs to run off and read the home directory and look at .opam, and maybe also access the network to be able to download something and things like that. And we want to start actually making that a lot more explicit, whilst also being able to turn it off if we want. And so we can actually enter write mode, and now we're in read-write mode, and we can run opam exec, and we get our 5.2. And you can see as well, actually, we've just bumped a snapshot as well. We've moved from the base image to a new hash snapshot, and that's because we did actually access the file system and do something. So even though that file no longer exists, because it's just a temporary log file, we do actually know that that happened, and so we do create a snapshot regardless. Whereas if we did something like the list command, we see we're still in the same snapshot. And why is that? It's because built into the shell, we have a notion of diff. And so there was no difference between the two things that came before. If we were to create a file, apologies for one hand. Again, you see we bumped along one new snapshot. So actually, the two states of the file system at the two different points are different. And so we can check that by seeing that different things happened. We can also edit that file again by putting world in there. And now we just want to double check that actually that file contains the things we think it does. And again, when we catted there, we didn't bump along any kind of snapshotting because we didn't touch the file system itself. But maybe that world was a mistake, and we want to go back to the world that we were just in. And that's as simple as saying undo. And now, if we cat hello.txt, we're back to it just saying hello. And so this is perhaps a more safe and friendly way of doing terminal programming that, given to ecologists, might be a much better way of being able to work out what did I do, what changed when I ran these commands, and then we can add all that into a bash history that, given to someone who's trying to re-implement it, especially, for example, computer scientists who are coming along to help, might actually be much more informative than just getting a bash history and the file system itself. Yes, Hannes.
I have a very question. Sorry, your undo is very beautiful because you went from 88B to B85 again. But then your cat somehow produced a different hash, the 74FC. How's that happening?
Great question. I'm guessing it's a bug. That's all I can work out from that. There's some things currently that are not very smart, and that's whenever we ran cat hello.txt, it did in fact create a snapshot. We just didn't move to it because they're the same. And so a little bit of programming there would say, actually, don't create that one, stay in this one, and the history doesn't get messed up. So I think that's the bug. But yeah, in principle, it should work. And similarly here, you can see in gray, we've got this network access. There's work there that we want to do to be able to use something like what we have in Docker for Mac, which is VPN Kit, again, another tool written in OCaml, to be able to do more reproducible things with the network, like working out when and what happened whenever you did a curl command and access the network and pulled something off of the internet. And so using a tool like this, we might end up in a world where we can actually start doing some more reproducible ecological research and then use whatever kind of specification that comes out of this to build the pipeline that we showed in the Markdown specification. So with that, I think that's everything I wanted to show today. All of this is very new, maybe the last month or so. But just a thank you to everyone who was part of this. Thomas Leonard, who some of you may know from the OCaml community, wrote the OCurrent library mostly, and has a really good blog post about actually what is OCurrent in terms of a monad and arrows and things like that, which is really great. And then a bunch of colleagues from computer science helped with the talk, and people from plant sciences and zoology in Cambridge. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We have 4 minutes for Q&A. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for this very nice talk. I'm wondering what so the shell and so on, does it rely on ZFS, or what kind of snapshots are you doing, or are you using Docker containers and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. At the moment, it relies on ZFS. OBuilder itself has an abstraction over the store that you use. So you can use ButterFS, XFS. There's a slow rsync copy backend. At the moment, we're keeping it to ZFS just because it's easier to reason about if we just say, this is Linux only for now. I think porting this to things like macOS is tricky. It doesn't have spectacular sandboxing or namespacing, things like that. But could be doable, and in the short term, certainly reasonable to, say, produce a remote version that could send all of this over to a Linux box, and you can develop on your Mac at the very least. Or, as you kind of said, there's a version of this where you just pipe everything to a Docker build or something like that and get something similar, maybe a little slower. What's nice about this is we have very low-level control over the different tools, for example, runc, or if we wanted to replace that with our own version of runc that, again, has even more strict kind of control over what namespaces are created and what's mounted, what's not mounted. I think that's kind of why we've gone in that direction. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I have a second question, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
So I've seen this nice graph of the different steps in the pipeline, and I was wondering whether you were also considering to generate one metadata data file of what happened from the beginning to the end. So like something like a software bill of materials, like SBOM or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we want to do that, but essentially attach that to the output data somehow from each build step. Essentially, a lot of ecological research kind of happens as you need some data, I've got some data, I email you the data. The kind of reproducible trail goes cold, right? And so being able to attach that to data in some way is something that we're interested in. Some data formats have very good support for adding like random metadata. Some data formats don't. Some file systems have really good support for that. Some file systems don't. So trying to think of a universal way to do that, I think, is useful. At the very least, just dumping a JSON file that kind of describes it is already works. We have other tools that Michael's developed, for example, where in Python you can import a specific library and it shims all possible, well, not all possible, but many, many different kind of effectful bits of your code, for example, reading a file, opening a file, network access, and just kind of grabs the arguments that you put into that, puts them into a file, and then once you're done with it, spits that out and says, this is actually what happened. So trying to do those sorts of things, I think, would be cool. Something in the OCaml world like that is a little more tricky, given that we kind of have ambient access, but without being able to change anything. So someone could use the Unix module and all bets are off for what just happened. There's another version of this shell that uses eBPF to be able to do this dynamically at runtime and try and check what files are being opened, what's being read, things like that. And we're interested in doing that. We're also interested in doing more privacy-focused stuff. So a lot of biodiversity results, particularly for endangered species, super valuable to poachers, for example. And people are very concerned about how we give access to this data. And so we want to look at how can we also do, say, something like information flow control within a system like this to be able to say, you just don't get access to this data. This doesn't get to flow out to the public network or something like that.
Okay, then one more round for applause for Patrick.
Thank you very much.